Emily Warren Roebling, the first woman chief engineer. Most of us have never been to New York City. Even if you haven't been there in person, you might recognize the image of the Brooklyn Bridge, which connects the boroughs of Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn by spanning the East River. Known for its stone arches, the Brooklyn Bridge contains 6 lanes for vehicles and a shared pedestrian and bicycle path. It does not allow big trucks. As of 2018, an average of over 116,000 vehicles, 30,000 pedestrians, and 3,000 cyclists travel over Brooklyn Bridge each day. The Brooklyn Bridge was designed by John A. Roebling. Construction began in 1869 and was completed in 1883. At the time, it was the longest suspension bridge in the world. What was not widely known, however, is that the construction of the bridge might not have been completed if not for the tireless work of Emily Warren Roebling, better known as the woman who saved the Brooklyn Bridge. Emily Warren was born in Cold Springs, New York on September 23, 1843, to a socially prominent family that could trace their family tree back to the Mayflower. She was the 11th of 12 children. Her father, Sylvanus Warren, was a state assemblyman and town supervisor. Her older brother, Governor K. Warren, was graduated from the United States Military Academy West Point, New York. He became a corps commander in the Union Army during the American Civil War. Emily was educated at Covenant School in the Georgetown Academy of the Visitation in Washington, D.C., where she studied history, astronomy, and algebra, among other subjects, in addition to needlework and housekeeping. In 1864, she met her future husband, Washington Roebling, who was serving as an engineer officer on her brother's staff. Washington was the son of John Roebling, an eminent German-American civil engineer who was the processing design of what he called the world's greatest bridge, the greatest bridge in existence. The future Brooklyn Bridge. The Brooklyn Bridge was the longest suspension bridge in the world at the time, and the first to be built with steel cables. Washington and Emily were married in 1865, and Emily accompanied her husband to Europe, where he went on his father's orders to study the latest techniques of constructing foundations underwater by using sealed pressure caissons. These caissons were watertight structures filled with compressed air that would allow workers to dig under the East River and plant bridges footing. While they were in Europe, they had one child, John Augustus Roebling II. In 1887, he was born in the same town where Washington Roebling's father had been born, Mulhouse, Germany. In 1887, John Roebling, Washington's father, started design work on the Brooklyn Bridge. In 1868, Washington and Emily returned with their son to America. On June 28, 1869, at Fulton Ferry, while John was standing at the edge of a dock working on fixing the location of where the bridge would be built, his foot was crushed by an arriving ferry. His injured toes were amputated. He refused further medical treatment and wanted to cure his foot by water therapy, which consisted of continuous pouring of water over the wound. His condition deteriorated. However, on July 22, 1869, 24 days after the accident, he died of tetanus at Washington and Emily's home, Hicks Street in Brooklyn Heights. Tetanus is a potentially fatal bacterial infection that affects the nerves and causes painful muscle contractions, particularly in the jaw and neck. It can interfere with the ability to breathe, eventually causing death in the case of John Roebling. Although there is no cure for tetanus, we now have a vaccine that can prevent it. After the death of his father, Washington immediately took over as chief of engineer. But it wasn't long before Washington also became injured due to the dangers of the construction effort. Upon taking over for his father, the most pressing job was to sink the caissons that would support the 275-foot granite towers on both the Brooklyn and Manhattan sides of the river. This was the first time that caissons were used in the United States. The caissons were large boxes that would be placed open upside down on the river bottom and then pressurized so that the workers could dig out the earth or stone beneath and gradually cause the caisson to sink deeper and deeper into the river. As the caisson went down, the bridge tower was built on top and gradually rose out of the water. Because he frequently entered and exited the pressurized caissons, Washington develops a case of caissons disease, or decompression or decompression sickness. Decompression sickness occurs when a body experiences rapid pressure reduction. For example, when divers go deeper and deeper under the water, the pressure becomes greater and greater. If they rise up to the surface too quickly, gases which were dissolved in their blood and tissues turn into bubbles in the blood vessels. These bubbles can cause great pain and can block the blood vessels. By rising more slowly, it allows the body to compensate for this. At the time that the Brooklyn Bridge was built, however, very little was known about Cajun's disease, except that it could lead to a person being crippled or even death. No one knew that it could be avoided by slowing down the body's ascent from the deep water. During the course of the construction of the bridge, over 100 workers were killed or left severely impaired by this illness. Washington became partially paralyzed, blind, deaf, and mute, or unable to speak. This was a real problem. Washington was the chief engineer. Without his expertise, construction of the bridge would have to stop. From 1872, he was essentially an invalid. Emily cared for him in their home in Trenton, New Jersey, where Roebling family steel cable factory was located, and in residence in Brooklyn Heights, from which Washington could observe the bridge through a telescope. Emily served as Washington's liaison with the engineering team, and over time she displayed such proficiency in the issues of the construction materials and cable fabrication that some observers concluded she had assumed the duties of chief engineer. She served as spokeswoman and advocate for her husband, reassuring officials that he was capable of managing the project. As the New York Times reported at the time, Miss Roebling applied herself to the study of engineering, and she succeeded so well that in a short time she was able to assume the duties of chief engineer. For more than 10 years, she dealt with contractors, supervised staff, inspected construction, and handling politicians and reporters. By the time the bridge was completed, she was known as the woman who managed one of the most significant construction projects of that time. It took 14 years for the bridge to be completed. When it was finished, Emily received praise for overseeing the construction of such an amazing architectural feat. During the opening ceremonies of the Brooklyn Bridge, U.S. Congressman Arabman Steele's Huey said that Emily Warren Roebling would forever be associated with all that is admirable in human nature and all that is wonderful in constructive world of art. He went on to say that the Brooklyn Bridge would be an everlasting monument to sacrificing devotion and her capacity for that higher education from which she has been too long disbarred. In other words, he was saying that by being so successful in building the Brooklyn Bridge, Emily had proved that the world that women were capable of learning difficult skills and should not be stopped from receiving a college education. In fact, she had made history by becoming the first female field engineer. On the day that the bridge was opened, Emily Warren Roebling was the first to cross it. She rode in a carriage carrying a live rooster in her lap as a sign of victory. After completed the Brooklyn Bridge project, Emily spent time supporting many women and humanitarian causes. She wrote an award-winning essay entitled A Wife's Disabilities, which criticized the many laws that discriminated against women, such as laws that restricted women from voting, owning property, and receiving an equal education to a man. She traveled the world. In 1896, she was presented to the Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom. She was even in St. Petersburg, Russia, for the coronation of Tsar Nicholas II in 1899. She fulfilled her dream of pursuing further education and received a law certificate from New York University. Although history began to forget Emily's work, her role as chief engineer has recently been rediscovered. A plaque still stands on the Brooklyn Bridge, dedicating it to the memory of her father-in-law, her husband, and Emily herself. Emily Warren Roebling died on February 28th in 1903 in Trenton, New Jersey.